Central bankers meet with financial industry executives in Switzerland this weekend to address the growing concern that banks are returning to their old ways of excessive risk-taking. Well, we partner with the Financial Times to bring you Lex on Bloomberg so you can get a sneak peek at the FT's flagship column a day early. Joining me live from London is Richard Stovin-Bradford. Richard, let's start with this. This is all happening at the Bank for International Settlements, the BIS. It's happening in Basel this weekend. Why has the BIS invited these bankers over?
Two things, really. One is that, yes, there does seem to be evidence that banks are going back to their old ways. Remember that banks have been able to get access to zero or near zero interest rate cash, and they've been using that to leverage up in exciting ways and make a packet in the past year. That has seen itself spill over into the bonus row, and I think that, and if you like, the whole idea that banks are really accreting value for themselves and not creating value in the real economy has drawn attention to the bankers' story. So I think BIS is saying, hang on a minute, let's just take stock.
Okay, now, the BIS, as some people know, is considered the bank for central banks. As such, it wants banks to be able to support the economy. At the same time, it doesn't want them to take too much risk. How do you have both? It sounds like a have your cake and eat it too kind of situation.
It certainly does. It's a strange thing, isn't it? It wants banks to invest in riskier assets like equities and corporate bonds for private companies, things like that. But banks, at the same time, are aware that regulators would quite like them to be invested in low-risk assets, and liquid assets such as government bonds. So in a funny kind of way, you've got risk, but not too much. Now, what's happening, I think, here is that the BIS has got its mind on what happened in the US, for example, in '94. You remember that in 1990, after the savings and loans crisis, Alan Greenspan slashed rates and banks were able to borrow from the Fed at, say, 3%, and then they went and had a bit of a party, and there was that whole boom period. When he started to tighten rates again in 1994, bonds fell, yields went up, liquidity dried up, and I think that's what the BIS has got its eye on in the background.
Richard, let's talk about the credibility issue for the BIS. The Bank for International Settlements, after all, came up with the Basel II rules on risk-weighted assets that the banks loved and which are now being revised in the wake of the crisis. So how closely should banks and, by extension, the general public be listening to the BIS when it comes to risk?
I think they shouldn't be hasty in dismissing this invitation to go and talk. Some banks are going, other banks are not. We shouldn't read too much into that, but we should pay attention. Why? Because the BIS was among one of the main organizations, in fact, that called the credit crisis we've just been through. So it got that one right, and I think it's just looking back and saying we've seen a pattern emerging. So I don't think we can ignore it at all. It's a serious warning signal. The question is, will banks that have been able to borrow on the cheap and make hay, if you like, while the sun shines, will they rush to behave? Let's see.
All right, Richard Stovin-Bradford from the FT's Lex desk in London. Richard, thank you as always.